Good evening, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. We're going to be learning the second chapter in the laws of Shabbat. And tonight we're going to be learning for who and in what case would Shabbat be allowed to be pushed away and desecrated. So the Rambam begins off by telling us that there are certain cases in regards to life and death matters where Shabbat is actually pushed away in order to save a life. And that's a very strong fundamental, and that is why he brings this as the second chapter right in the beginning of the laws of Shabbat, so that we should know that all of the laws that we're going to be discussing, if we're talking about a life and death matter, then all of these are not applicable, as we're going to see. So the Rambam says that whenever you have a person who is possible that they're going to die because of us keeping Shabbat, so then we should not keep Shabbat and let that person die, God forbid. Or even if it's a possibility, even though it's not sure that it might happen, but still, if there's a possibility for it, we should make sure to save that person rather than keep Shabbat, because Shabbat wants us. God wants us that we should desecrate this Shabbat in order to be able to perform more Shabbats in the future, rather than just dying now, keeping Shabbat. So, if a person is in a state where there's a possibility that they might die, they're in a life-threatening situation, and the doctor says, we have to do a certain thing, even though it desecrates Shabbat, you have to travel to a certain place, you have to do a certain procedure, even if you have other doctors that are arguing with this doctor and say that you don't have to do it, if there's a medical authority that says that you have to do a certain procedure, so then you should do it, and you should do it on Shabbat. And even if they said, we have to take a certain medication or to do a certain procedure that will last a certain amount of time, for a couple days, for 8 days, let's say, the Rambam says. So we say, start right now, even though it's Shabbat, and we're going to have to desecrate 2 Shabbats, today and in a week's time on the 8th day. And we don't say, wait till the evening so that we won't desecrate 2 Shabbats instead of only desecrate 1 Shabbat. Rather, whatever has to be done, we do. If it's to light a candle, to shut off the light, if it's to cook, bake, wash, whatever it is, we do it on Shabbat in order to keep this person safe and healthy. And when we do them, we shouldn't ask a non-Jew to do them or a child to do this, but rather, as a grown-up, who we are, we should do it in order to show that Shabbat is very great, but when it comes to saving a life, it is greater. And Shabbat wants us to do this. And it's not because Shabbat is not important, but on the contrary, Shabbat is important, and that's why Shabbat tells us to save a life, you should push me away in order to save that person. And then the Rambam goes in to discuss what is a situation where a person could be in a life-threatening situation. So the Rambam says that if a person is ailing in their eyes, so technically speaking, what's the big deal? But if it's such a severe ailment, if the person is feeling so sick that there was so many tears dripping from their eye, or there was blood dripping from their eyes, so then in such a case we say this person is in a dangerous state, dangerously ill, and we would perform whatever they need. And so if we're talking about any inner organs of our body, so then in such a case, if we're talking about an internal bleed or an internal issue, so then it's classified as if it's something which could lead to a life-threatening situation, and therefore we would desecrate Shabbat for that person. If it means to take them to the hospital and drive, or whatever it might be. But if it's just an external problem, their fingers bleeding or whatever, and it's something which is not life-threatening, so then we should not do that. But if there's a doctor that says, even if it's an external thing, and the doctor says that it's something which could be life-threatening, so then we should do exactly as the doctor says to do. So if a person was bit by a dog, or by a certain reptile or something which could be dangerous, so then we do everything that we have to do in order to save them. Now, in such a case where Shabbat is being desecrated in order to serve a person's life, and now the doctor says this person needs to eat a fig. That's it. It's the case that the Rambam says. This person needs to eat a fig. Now, 10 people run off to go get him a fig. And now each one of these bring a fig. Now, there are 10 figs that were brought. So essentially, this person only needed one. But 10 people went and did it. So even if the person was already ate that fig and became healthy, and now comes another person and brings another fig for them, because they weren't aware that they already had one, still, they would not be liable. It's okay because they were doing it they were doing it in a permissible form. They were trying to help this person, as long as they didn't know. And if we're talking about, if this person the sick person needed to eat 2 figs, let's say, and now you go to the tree and you want to, chop off a stem that has figs, and there is one stem that has 1 fig, and then, another stem that has 1 fig, and then there's another stem that has 3 figs hanging off that one stem. So instead of trimming 2 separate stems, which are 2 actions that are not allowed to do on Shabbat, instead, it's better to just trim 1 stem that has 3 figs, even though you only need 2. But still, since you're doing something less of a desecration of Shabbat, so then it's obviously better. But whenever we prepare food or we prepare something for someone who is sick, who is dangerously ill, so if they're preparing food for this person on Shabbat, so the food is being cooked up, there's water being heated, there is food being cooked on the fire, which is something which we're not allowed to do generally, but for the sick person we're allowed to do it. Someone who is healthy is not allowed to eat the leftovers food, because the rabbis were worried that if we say that a healthy person is allowed to eat the leftovers, so then maybe they'll prepare extra so that the healthy people will be able to have what to eat. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. Unless it's a case where they are slaughtering an animal for this person. So then the rest of the meat is allowed to be eaten as long as it's raw. So because, you gotta slaughter the animal, you do the whole animal. There's no half an animal being slaughtered. So it's not, there's no possibility of making anything extra for the healthy people. Now, what about a situation where a person is not in a dangerous situation? So they're sick, they're not feeling well, they're in bed, whatever. In such a case, what are you allowed to do for them, and what are you not allowed to do for them? So, the Rambam says that we are allowed to have a non-Jew perform anything for that person. In other words, even if it's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat, we're allowed to explicitly ask from a non-Jew, because they don't have to keep Shabbat. So we're allowed to ask them, can you please turn on the light for this person? Can you please turn off the light? Can you please cook up a meal for them? So on and so forth. Because this person is sick, so now the Torah says that we should take care of the sick people, and Shabbat says that you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do it. Although, generally speaking, if we're not talking about a sick person, we're not allowed to just ask a non-Jew, can you please cook up a meal for me? We didn't prepare enough food for our Shabbos dinner, or there's not enough light in this room. Can you please turn on the light for me? That's something which we're not allowed to do generally. Only if it's in the case of a sick person. By the way, just to mention over here about this idea, if you don't explicitly tell the non-Jew to do it, it's a little bit complicated laws, which we're going to get into later, but if you don't actually tell the non-Jew to do it, and they do it on their own, so then if they turn on the light on their own, so then you're allowed to have pleasure from it. But in the case of a sick person, you're allowed to explicitly tell that person, the non-Jew, to do it for you. And now the Rambam goes into a little bit of a side idea in the same context, and he says, a woman who is in the process of giving birth. Now, once she starts giving birth, in other words, I guess once her waters break, I believe that's what he says, from when she starts giving birth. Actually, he says when a woman squats to give birth. That's the term that he uses. In such a case, then it is considered as if her life is in danger. And therefore, whatever we have to do, we are allowed to do for her. Even though, technically speaking, her life is not necessarily in danger. But it's a possibility that it might happen. So, it's a special case on its own. And the Rambam, that's why the Rambam highlights it on its own. And he says, we're allowed to do whatever she asks for. We're allowed to turn on the light. We're allowed to, light a fire for her. Whatever it is. And go call the midwife, of course. And so on. Now, if there is a possibility of not having to do whatever action we're doing, if there is a way that we can do it without desecrating Shabbat straight out, so then we should try to do that. So in other words, if we can do something in an uncharacteristic manner, so to speak, which is a concept, when we do something, instead of doing it in the regular form, we should do it in a weird way, so to speak. So then we can do that. But if not, then we just do it in the regular way in order to make sure that she has everything that she needs. Now, that's in a case where we're talking about a Jewish woman. But if we're talking about, or just any other regular woman, in a case of a woman who is an idolater, so in such a case, the Rambam says that if it's a Jewish doctor and there's not a need for him to be doing the birth, so then he shouldn't do it. In other words, he shouldn't desecrate Shabbat for someone who is not keeping Shabbat. That is in a case where it's actual idolater. But if it's someone who is not an idolater, so even though they don't keep Shabbat, but still, they can give them birth, but they should not desecrate. They should not violate the Shabbat laws for her. The Rambam continues by saying that the different steps of a woman who gives birth. In other words, like this. While she gives birth, of course, we are able to desecrate Shabbat for her. Up until 3 days after she gives birth. Now, that in that period of time, it doesn't matter whether she says she needs it or whether she said she doesn't need it. Doesn't matter. We do whatever is needed for her. After that period, from 3 to 7 days after the birth, so then if she says that she needs a certain thing to be done, she's feeling cold and she wants a fire to be lit, or she needs food or whatever, so then we do it if she says that she needs it. If she says that she doesn't need it, so then we trust her word and we don't do it. From 7 to 30 days, so then she is in a state as if someone who is sick, but not in a danger zone, and therefore we don't do it ourselves. We ask from a non-Jew to do it for us instead. And when a woman is in the middle of giving birth, and God forbid she passes away during the labor, so now in such a case, we're not sure if this child, if this fetus really hasn't been born yet, if it survived. So we do whatever is needed in order to save the child, even though we're not sure that this child is alive. But still, if we have to go and run across a public domain and bring a knife, to come and take out the baby, we do whatever we gotta do. And now, because of this, the Rambam goes into a little bit of a different topic in regards to save a life. How does this work? So the Rambam says, in general, if there is a possibility of saving a life on Shabbat, we should run for it and do it. You don't have to ask anyone permission. You don't have to go running to the rabbi's house. Rabbi, am I allowed to do this? This is the scenario. Don't. Just go, save the life, and you'll come and ask the questions afterwards. For instance, if a person sees a child drowning, falling in the ocean, so go get a fishing net and come and take out the child. Get onto your boat, go catch him. Now, even though when you pick up this fishing net, there might be some fish in it, which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. We're not allowed to go fishing on Shabbat. But still, it is totally permissible. So much so, the Rambam says, that even in a case where a person is actively desecrating Shabbat just for his own pleasure. And this person has decided to go fishing. And he takes up his fishing net. And a baby is inside this fishing net. And he has saved this baby's life. He would not be liable for his actions because of how this ended up. Even though he had no idea that he was saving this baby's life. But because he did it, so then this person would not be liable. Now, this is obviously something which we're not allowed to do. But in a case where it happens, that's what the Rambam says. And whatever, if there is a fire and there's people that have to be saved, even if we're not sure that there's someone in the house, but if there's a possibility that someone is in the house, we do whatever we need to do in order to extinguish the fire and save them. And whoever is the first to act and save a person's life is obviously very praiseworthy, and we do not have to go and ask permission from the courts. The Rambam, says this a second time to highlight that it's something which we should run and go and save this person's life. And even if there is a big avalanche that has fallen and there are people under it, and now we go and we even if we're not sure that there's a person there, we should still go and check to see if there's someone under it on Shabbat. And even if we found the people there and the people are dead, sadly, if there is still a possibility that there are people even lower down, that are even deeper down under the avalanche, we should still dig to go and find them, because there's a possibility that there might be a live person deep down. So, what happens if a person, now the Rambam goes on to a little bit of a different topic, and he says, what happens to a person who is traveling in the desert? And now, this person does not know when Shabbat is, lost their calendar, and now doesn't know when Shabbat is. Today, I don't know if it's so possible. This person lost reception, their battery died. I guess it is possible still. And now, what do we do? So, this comes in the idea of saving a life, as we shall see. So the Rambam says we should count 6 days from whatever day it is, and on the 7th day we perform Shabbat, and that's when we celebrate Shabbat, make Kiddush, and so on and so forth. Now, during that Shabbat, this Shabbat is not necessarily the real Shabbat. It's the Shabbat that was decided because of the lack of knowledge of what the actual day is. That Shabbat, this person is still allowed to travel, and if he's allowed to do whatever it is that he has to survive. Even if it means to work. Whatever work would mean in that setting, but in order to keep himself alive, he's allowed to do. And every other day of the week, since it is also a possibility that that day is Shabbat, because we don't really know what the real day of the week it is, so person should only be doing what is necessary to keep themselves surviving and alive. But in other words, if they have enough in order to live for the next couple days, so then they should not work. Whatever work we're talking about, whatever investment of something, action of labor, where it involves the desecration of Shabbat, they should not do it until it's necessary for today, for now, in order to survive. But if there is a certain day, and he knows that he left home 7 days ago, exactly a week ago, so that day, even though he doesn't know exactly what day of the week it was that he left, but he knows that it was exactly 7 days ago, so that day he's allowed to work even more, because he knows that he didn't leave on Shabbat. He didn't leave on his trip on Shabbat. But all the other days of the week, he's only allowed to do what is absolutely necessary. And in the case when there is a war, and there are people that are coming and, they lay siege on a Jewish city. So, if we're talking about monetary issues, so then we don't desecrate Shabbat in order to start a war against them. But if it's on the border, if we're talking about the cities that are on the border of the land, and especially in the land of Israel, so it doesn't matter whatever they're coming for. We start war with them. We do whatever it is needed. We make weapons. We bring weapons. We start a war because the fact that there are people that are trying to instigate and trying to create violence with the Jewish people on the borderline, it means that they're trying to come and trying to conquer the land of Israel, and therefore we do whatever is needed in order to keep the land of Israel safe. And so too also, similarly, if we're talking about a ship at sea, or a city which is, there is a tsunami, there is a flood, so then whatever it is, it's a mitzvah to go on Shabbat and use every possible mean that we have in order to save the people over there. And if we're talking about a war, if we're talking about waging war, if there was a Jewish king, this is going back to the time of the temple, when the Jewish people would, if there was a Jewish king that waged war with the nations around them, so then they have to do it up till 3 days before Shabbat. In other words, the king shouldn't start a war on Friday afternoon when it's right before Shabbat. So if it's on Wednesday, so you have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so then that's it's ample time in order to start the war, and then they're allowed to continue it even on Shabbat. And the Rambam finishes off this chapter by saying that when it comes to a war which was a commandment, God said to wage war in a certain situation. For instance, the story of Joshua when he conquered Jericho, that was on Shabbat. And the Rambam says that Joshua did it specifically on Shabbat because that's when God told him to do it. And that is the chapter of Rambam for today, the second chapter of the Laws of Shabbat, learning in what situations, for who and for what, and when are we allowed to desecrate Shabbat. And because it is such a fundamental idea, that's why the Rambam brings this right at the beginning, so we should know that if there is a certain situation where there's a life-threatening situation, we are allowed to, Shabbat wants us to push it away in order to save a person's life. Very well, my friends, we're going to continue tomorrow, and we will see you then.